So today we're launching a brand new series, and the series is called The Eternal Gospel. And as a way of sort of introducing this series, I want to do a little activity with you. And so up on the screen, I've got a question. And the question is this: what comes to your mind when you hear this? So I'm going to share with you a word or a phrase, and I want you to share just the first thing that comes to your mind. So you might want to just whisper it to the person next to you. You might want to call it out to the front, or you might just think it in your mind, okay? And it's okay if you love this or you hate this. These might be sort of things that get a mixed response. So the first one is this. What comes to your mind when you hear this? Coriander. Yum. I see some heads shaking. It's quite the controversial herb, this one. For me, I'm kind of on the fence with this, but there's all sorts of different responses that I know I've heard from people with this word. Number 2, what comes to your mind when you hear this? Lockdown. Yes, who said yes? For a lot of us, I think lockdown is going to bring up thoughts of renovations, panic. But I know there are some introverts amongst us who secretly rejoice when we hear those announcements that we're going back into lockdown. Number 3, let's hope that never happens again. What comes to your mind when you hear this? Christmas. Holidays, yay. Jesus. Lots of things. But, you know, even though a lot of people love Christmas, I know in our family, we have the Christmas tree that we set up every year, and it's a big thing. But there's some people that are like, oh, I'll be going through all of this once again. Now, I heard someone say that to me down the front. Final one, what comes to your mind when you hear this? The 3 angels' messages. The reason I sort of introduced it this way, because I know that in a group the size that we have here, there's probably people that have a whole bunch of different sort of reactions when they hear this phrase. Some of you might be thinking, the 3 angels' messages, what on earth is that even talking about? I've never heard that phrase before. Some of you might be thinking, yikes, scary revelation stuff, end times. And others of you this might be something that gets you very motivated and you think that is such an awesome thing for us to be talking about. Well, today, we're not going to be unpacking, and in this series, we're not going to be unpacking all 3 of the 3 angels' messages, but we're going to be focusing on angel number 1. And our hope, I guess, for you for this series is that by the end of it, when you hear about the 3 angels' messages, and especially this first angel that we're talking about, that you'll see something that's really positive, Christ-centered, and that's really relevant for your life. Now, for those who are there going, I've never heard of this phrase before, don't worry, we're going to start with a little bit of an overview for you to begin with. So the 3 angels' messages, it appears in the last book of the Bible, so the book of Revelation. And to be honest, Revelation is a bit of a wild book. If you have never read Revelation before and you just sit down and you start in Revelation chapter 1 and read right through to Revelation 22, your head is probably going to be spinning by the end, and you're going to be probably very confused and wondering, what on earth did I just read? But basically, the book of Revelation is a vision. And it's a vision that God gave to this person by the name of John. He was one of Jesus' 12 disciples. And he was just sitting exiled on this island of Patmos one day when God shows him this really interesting, wild, wacky vision with beasts and all sorts of dramatic imagery and symbols. And as you read through, it's important to realize as well, even though John is the one who wrote these things down, he didn't come up with the symbols. He didn't come up with all this imagery. He just saw these things that God showed to him, and he wrote them down. So the 3 angels' messages, we find them in chapter 14 of Revelation, right there in the heart of the book. And so John there is in vision, and he's looking up into the sky, and he sees this powerful angel flying across the sky. And as he's looking up, watching this angel bellows out this message with this really loud voice to the people below. So John's watching this. And then this second angel comes flying through the sky with a second angel to loudly proclaim to the earth. And then a third angel comes across as well. Now, before we jump into the message of this first angel, just a couple of questions that are going to help us sort of understand a bit of what we're talking about here. Firstly, who do these angels represent? Well, remember, this is the book of Revelation, and Revelation is a book of symbols, so just because we see depicted these angels flying through the sky doesn't mean that their fulfillment will be literal angels. So who do they represent? Well, let's read the description of this first angel. So this is what it says. Then I saw another angel flying in midair, and he had the eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth, to every nation, tribe, language, and people. So according to this description, this angel has been given the task of proclaiming the gospel to the world. Well, question, when you look at the rest of the Bible, who is the group of people that God gave that task of to proclaim the gospel to the whole world? It was the Jews, the disciples. It was the followers of God. And there's a whole bunch of different places where we can find this. For example, Mark chapter 16, verse 14 to 15, it says, afterwards he appeared to the 11, so this is Jesus. He's risen from the dead and he's meeting with his disciples. And he said to them, go into all the world and proclaim the gospel to the whole creation. So this is the task that God has given his followers. And sure, the literal angels support in this task as well, don't they? But primarily, I think it makes sense that these angels represent Jesus' followers who have been given this task to proclaim. So, question number 2, if the angels represent Jesus' followers, which includes us, what time of history is really in focus here in the 3 angels' messages? Well, there's a number of clues that we could look at, but probably the clearest one is that immediately after we see John describing these 3 angels flying through the sky, we see this description of the second coming. And so in Revelation 14, so verse 6 to 13 is where we find 3 angels flying through the sky. And in verse 14, it says this, then I looked, and behold, a white cloud. And on the cloud sat one like the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle. Now, this verse is saturated in language that sounds like other parts of the Bible that are describing the second coming. We've got Jesus coming on this cloud. He's got this sickle. That's a tool for a harvest. And harvest is another sort of metaphor that Jesus used to describe the second coming. And so we have this description here of the second coming. So to summarize, what we see here is the 3 angels' messages represent Jesus' followers with urgent messages to share with the whole world in preparation for Jesus' soon return. In other words, there are a series of messages that God is saying is really important for us to know, and it's a series of messages that God is saying that's really important for us to share with others as well. So let's dive on into message angel number 1, and we're going to read it through. And it's not very long, it's only 2 verses, so we're doing 4 sermons on these 2 verses. And here they are. Revelation 14, verse 6 to 7. And then I saw another angel flying in midair, and he had the eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth, to every nation, tribe, language, and people. He said in a loud voice, fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and the springs of water. Now, you would notice that I've highlighted a number of phrases there. Those phrases are eternal gospel, fear God, give him glory, and worship him. And these 4 phrases, I think, are the key phrases of this message. And these are the 4 phrases that we're going to be unpacking in these 4 sermons that we're going to be going through. So today, we're going to be looking at this. The first one of these is this eternal gospel that God is calling us as his followers to be both understanding and to proclaiming to every nation, tribe, language, and people. So the gospel. A few questions for us to unpack. Number 1, what is the gospel? Number 2, why is the gospel eternal? And number 3, why does the world need the gospel so desperately? So number 1, what is the gospel? Well, quite literally, the word gospel just means good news. And this is in the English, it's also in the Greek word that was translated as this. In the English, the word gospel comes from this old English word, Godspell. I don't really know how it's pronounced, but it's basically two words stuck together. There's two parts. It's from God, meaning good, and spell, meaning news or a story. So gospel is literally good news or good story. In the Greek, here we go, I've got a Greek word for you here. The word is euangelion, and once again, it's two sort of parts stuck together. Eu, which means good, and then angelo, which means to proclaim news. And so, quite literally, these words mean good news, or good story, or to proclaim good news. Now, I don't know about you, but I love sharing good news. And I've got a picture to share with you here today, which is really exciting because the person in this picture is actually here today and probably doesn't know that they're going to be on the screen. But here is a picture. So this was a day of good news. And so on this day, this is the day that Kylie and I shared with Kylie's parents, Bronwyn and Trevor, that we're having a baby. And so I remember what we did, we had this little card that you see there, and so they have, this is their second grandchild, and so we wrote this little card supposedly from their other grandchild, Leo, and the card said, "Hi, Nana and Granddad," and basically it said, "I'm so looking forward to introducing you to my new cousin." And so they got it there, and they were reading through the card, and suddenly you just saw the light bulb switch on that, whoa, there's another baby coming along the way, and you can see the reaction that happens from that. And so that was a day of gospel. That was a day of good news. But when the Bible talks about the gospel, it's not just talking about any good news, it's talking about some specific good news. And this is what, when the Bible refers to the gospel, this is what it's referring to. The gospel in the Bible refers to the good story of Jesus and what it means for us. The good story of Jesus and what it means for us. Now I'm going to share with you a number of verses that kind of show, I think, that this is what the Bible is meaning when it talks about the gospel. So firstly, now we're not going to read through all of these, but if you see the part that's highlighted in yellow, where it says the gospel of Christ, often in the Bible, when it talks about the gospel, it doesn't just say the gospel, but it says the gospel of Christ, or in other words, the good news of Jesus. And so the gospel is the good news of Jesus. Let me share with you another verse. Acts chapter 8 and verse 4 to 5. It says, "Now those who had been forced to scatter went around proclaiming the good news of the word. Philip went down to the main city of Samaria and began proclaiming the Christ to them." So here we have, in two verses, we have gospel, or as it's translated there, good news, and we have proclaiming Christ. And so this verse is really equating these two things. So it's describing these people, these followers of Jesus that are experiencing this persecution, that are being scattered all over the land, and wherever they go, they are proclaiming the good news, they're proclaiming the gospel. And then it gives this example of Philip, and it says he goes, and he doesn't say he proclaims the gospel, it says he proclaims the Christ. And so to teach people the story of Jesus is to be teaching people the gospel. Another verse, Mark chapter 1 and verse 1. Now, you probably know that the book of Mark is often called the Gospel of Mark. And the book of Mark just basically gives this account of the story of Jesus from his very beginning, and he gets baptized all the way through to his resurrection. And the story, Mark's account begins like this: the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And there's that word there. And basically he's saying, I'm going to tell you the story of the gospel, and then he just tells the story of Jesus. So what this means is that whenever we share the story of Jesus with someone and we explain why it is good news, we're sharing with them the gospel. One more verse to share with you on the sort of definition of the gospel. I like this verse here because once again we see the Bible equating two things together. And so in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 17 it says, "For Christ did not send me to baptize but to preach the gospel." And then the very next verse, he says, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God." And so here, Paul is equating preaching the gospel with preaching the message of the cross. So why the cross? So yes, the gospel is the whole story of Jesus, but the centerpiece of that story is the story of the cross. It was at the cross that we see God's love most clearly. It's at the cross where Jesus won that great victory over sin and death, and it was at the cross where the door was opened for our salvation, our forgiveness, and eternal life. And so the gospel is the good story of Jesus and what it means to us. Number 2, why is the gospel eternal? Now, I sort of spent a bit of time just thinking about this, and I came up with a few ideas of why in Revelation, when it talks about the gospel, this is the only place I'm aware of where the gospel is referred to as the eternal gospel or the everlasting gospel. Why is it that the gospel is eternal? Well, here's a few of the ideas that I came up with. Number 1, Jesus is eternal, and therefore his gospel is eternal. So if the gospel is the story of Jesus, who's an eternal person, then that's a long story. And so yes, the cross is the great centerpiece of the story of Jesus, but the story begins way earlier. It begins even before Jesus was born in Bethlehem. It begins all the way back into the Old Testament. It begins all the way back in creation. It even begins all the way back before the world was created. And then if we go in the other direction, the story of Jesus, it continues even beyond the resurrection, beyond the New Testament, beyond our time, beyond the second coming. And it's a story that goes all the way on into the distant eternity that lies before us. And so Jesus is eternal, and so his story is eternal as well. The second reason I sort of thought of as why the gospel is eternal is that the picture the gospel shows of God is one that will last forever. One of the reasons the story of Jesus is such good news is that it shows us this awesome picture of the love of God. I want to share with you a few verses that I think, a few sort of parts of the story that I think really sort of show the love of God really on display. And so the first one is in John chapter 15, verse 13. It's a simple verse. It simply says, "There is no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends." And that's what we see in the story of the cross. We see a God who loves us so much that he would lay down his life for us, his friends. But the story is even better than that. In Romans chapter 5 and verse 7 to 8, it says, "Now most people would not be willing to die for an upright person, though someone might perhaps be willing to die for a person who is especially good. But God showed his great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners." And so Jesus, when he died there and was hanging there on the cross, he wasn't just there dying for people that were kind to him and people that were friendly to him and that people that always obeyed and were loyal to him. But Jesus hung there for people that were rebellious to him, people that had wanted nothing to do with him. Jesus hung there on the cross for his enemies. It shouts out to us the incredible love of Jesus. Another couple of places in Luke chapter 23, verse 33. Here we get right sort of at the heart of this story of the cross. And it says, "When they came to a place called the Skull, they nailed him to the cross. And the criminals were also crucified, one on his right and one on his left. Jesus said, 'Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing.'" Just picture this scene. You've got Jesus, and he's just been through the most unimaginable suffering at the hands of these Roman soldiers. They have whipped him until his flesh is cut apart. They have put a crown of thorns upon his head, and they've hit it with a rod. They've put nails through his hands and through his feet. And Jesus is up there hanging on the cross. And what does he think about? He looks out and he sees those people who nailed him to that cross. And he says those words, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." On the cross, we see the love of God on such incredible clarity of display. And then the next couple of verses, we see this scene where it says, "The crowd watched and the leaders scoffed at Jesus. 'He saved others,' they said. 'Let him save himself if he is really God's Messiah, the chosen one.' The soldiers mocked him too. They called out to him, 'If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself.'" And so here's all these soldiers, again, mocking Jesus and saying to him, "If you're really the Son of God, if you're really the Messiah, then come down from that cross." But the awesome and kind of ironic thing is that, yes, Jesus is the Messiah. Yes, he is the Son of God. Yes, he is God hanging up there. But why was he not coming down from that cross? To save the very people that were there mocking him. And so once again, we see we see in the story of the cross, the love of God on such beautiful display. And I believe that the love of God like this that we see displayed in this story of the cross is something that we're going to be moved by, not just for the next few years, but it's something that we're going to be moved by for all of eternity. I want you just to imagine, let's say 100 billion years into the future. Now I don't know where you'll be in that time, who knows, but somewhere in the paradise of God, in the world that he's prepared for us. And I just want you to imagine you're there 100 billion years into eternity. And once again, you're reflecting on the story of Jesus. You're reflecting on the story of the cross. And once again, your heart is so moved by that awesome picture of love that you see there. The story of the cross is something that I think we're going to be reflecting on for all of eternity. And the third reason that I think that the gospel is the eternal gospel, is that it tells us the only way that we can be saved. The Bible gives us only one gospel. Not two, not three, one gospel. The story of Jesus and what he did for us upon the cross. That story shows us the only way that God has ever given us as to how we can be saved. Whether you lived right back in the Old Testament, whether you lived at the time of Jesus, whether you're living in 2023, whether you're living right up until the second coming of Jesus, the only way that we have to be saved is through what Jesus did for us upon that cross. That Jesus came and loved us so much that he died for us. I want to share with you a quote from the book Desire of Ages, which is a book on the story of Jesus, so it's a gospel book. And I think this quote here is one of the clearest descriptions that I've come across that describes how it is that Jesus, when he died there on the cross, actually saved us and what was actually taking place. So here we go. It says, Christ was treated as we deserve, that we may be treated as he deserves. He was condemned for our sin in which he had no share, that we might be justified by his righteousness in which we had no share. He suffered the death which was ours, that we might receive the life which was his. By his stripes we are healed. I think I've shared this quote with you before, which shows how much I like this one here. But what it's saying to us is that everything that happened to Jesus, all of that suffering that he experienced, all those horrible things, were the things that we deserve as collectively as a human race. They're the things that we deserved, but Jesus took our place upon the cross. And then everything that the Bible, all those promises we have of eternal life and of being able to live in paradise and being able to live forever and be forgiven and all these wonderful things that God has promised us, they're the things that Jesus deserves, but we get to take his place. That's more than forgiveness. We get to be treated as Jesus deserves. Now, Jesus died a sinner's death, even though he had not contributed anything to that sin. And the reward that we get to have is the reward of someone who lived a perfect life, even though we have contributed nothing to that perfect life. At the cross, Jesus switched places with us. And if we choose to, we get to switch places with him as well. Never has there been greater news than that for a world as twisted as ours is. And so, it tells the only way of salvation. And that brings us to our final question that we're going to unpack today, and that is, why does the world need the gospel? Why does the world need the gospel? Well, as you've seen, the first angel's message describes the gospel going to every nation, every tribe, every language, and every people. There's an urgency here. There's a sense that every person must hear this story. But why? Why is it that the world needs to hear the good news of Jesus? Well, it's because at the end of the day, the hope the true lasting hope that the world really needs is only found in the gospel. It's only found in the story of Jesus. It's found ultimately in nowhere else. Romans chapter 1 and verse 16 says this: "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes." I like how it says that it is the power of God. The gospel is the power of God. Now, I don't think I really fully grasp the significance of what this verse is saying. But there's something about the gospel story that has an incredible, powerful effect upon our lives. But maybe here's something that might help to explain why it is that the gospel is the power of God coming into our lives. In the book of Revelation, you see this grand battle taking place between God and Satan. And at the center of this battle is us. God is wanting us to choose him, and Satan is wanting us to side with him. There's this cosmic tug of war over our lives and over our allegiance. And Satan has all the tricks in the book to try to persuade us to join his side. Satan will deceive us, he'll force us, he'll tempt us, he'll trick us. He doesn't care how it happens, he just wants you to be on his side. But God, on the other hand, is a God of love. And because he's a God of love, he doesn't want to deceive us. He doesn't want to force us. He won't tempt us or trick us. He only wants you to be on his side if you're there freely, if you've chosen to be on his side. Well, the question is, how can you make someone choose to be on your side? Well, you can't. You can't force someone to love you in return. So what does God do? I want to share with you another quote from that book, Desire of Ages. And it says this: "The exercise of force is contrary to the principles of God's government. He desires only the service of love, and love cannot be commanded. It cannot be won by force or authority. Only by love is love awakened." Why is the story of Jesus the power of God that brings salvation? Because the story of Jesus is the clearest picture we have of God's love that has ever been given to us. The gospel has power because it reveals the heart of God. The gospel has power because it reveals God's way of salvation. And the gospel has power because it awakens love within us. And that's what is going to change the world. The last verse I want to share with you is John chapter 12, verse 32. And this is Jesus looking towards the time where he will be hanging up there upon the cross. And Jesus says this: "And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself." At the heart of the three angels' messages, and at the heart of the mission that Jesus has invited all of us to be a part of, is that task of lifting Jesus up to the world. To lift him up, to share his story so that people can see how much they're loved, and so that people will experience a power that leads to their salvation. When Jesus is lifted up, it will draw all people to himself.